All right, so I wanted to talk about this I seen from Breaking 911. It's kind of a crazy thing. So they say just in city of Oakland to give families making under $59,000 a year a $500 check each month with no rules on how they spend it. Low-income families that are white are excluded from the program. So, I mean, if you read through the comments, it's mostly just a complete cesspool. But I mean, there's some sane comments, but Um, so there seems to be some confusion on is it a privately funded thing or is it a taxpayer funded thing? So there's kind of two different ways of going about it. Number one, if it's a taxpayer funded thing, this is absolutely and utterly insane, right? Like just beyond insane. Um, and again, people say, "Oh, it's reparations." No, it's not reparations, right? For the simple reason that, again, reparations have been being paid for the longest time. If you look at welfare payments, it's whites that put more money into the system than they get out on average, and blacks take more out than they put in. So, um, well, de facto reparations has been going on for, two generations now. Um, so that's the first thing to bring up. But number two, um, how can you argue that you've been hurt because of something that happened generations ago and the people that should be forced to pay it was, again, like another thing too, like it was a very small percentage of white people that owned slaves. So even if you do want to argue that people who had ancestors that owned slaves need to pay reparations, we do realize it's a very, very small percentage of people. Right, so these are some of the lies that are told that, and the other big lie too is that this is the reason why blacks are have lower incomes, more likely to be in jail, so on and so forth. Just negative life outcomes in general, which is a complete lie, right? It's a complete lie, right? That I mean, if you look at the marriage rate, if you look at the prison rates, go back 100 years. Blacks, the single parenthood rate was very low, at least compared to now. The likelihood of ending up in prison was lower than it was right now. And was it so again, like the whole point is very simple that you go back 100 years, blacks, the single parenthood rate was significantly lower, less blacks in prison per capita. But no one can argue there's more racism nowadays than there was 100 years ago. I mean, Jim Crow was still, segregation was still around, right? So the whole blacks are kept down because of more racism these days. It's completely false. Now, does that mean, do I think, and does that mean that there's literally no racism? Of course, there is some racism. Obviously, there's some racism. But the whole point is very simple in that it doesn't explain the majority of this stuff. Racism maybe explains into the single digits of the reason why blacks earn less money, end up in jail more, all this kind of stuff. The system is the same thing as well, right? The reason why blacks are in prison more is not because of more racism. It's because they're more likely to commit crimes, right? And the other thing that really bothers me about this stuff too is one of the big reasons, the reality, one of the big things that is actually causing blacks pain and suffering is things like the welfare state, right? This is one of the realistic reasons why. Again, the minute the welfare state was put in, black single parenthood numbers have gone up ever since. We know that kids who grow up in single parent households are significantly more likely to end up in jail, to end up in the same situation the parent was, to end up a drug user, to be unemployed, to not graduate high school, right? So if these people really cared about reducing blacks' pain and suffering, they would be trying to reduce single parenthood. But are any of them doing that? No. right? So at the end of the day, it's a political thing. No, not for the individual people themselves, but for all of these politicians that are complaining about racism and all this stuff. At the end of the day, they don't care about racism. They care about power. They want to push a political narrative. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about this, too. Right? There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this. Like I said, we know for sure kids who grow up in single parent, specifically single mother households, significantly more likely to end up in jail, significantly more likely to end up a drug user, significantly more likely to perpetuate the cycle of single parenthood. Um, Basically, every major negative life outcome, they are more likely to end up in that situation. So, again, if the goal was reducing the pain and suffering of blacks, why aren't more people talking about that? If you're not talking about that, you don't care about the pain and suffering of blacks. You care about pushing a political narrative and power, right? That is based, like, the main reason why Black Lives Matter exists is to push a political narrative. Black Lives Matter raised insane amounts of money over the last year. Have they provided any examples of how that money is going to help suffering black people? No, they haven't shown it once, right? This is the big problem too. Like, until we can acknowledge this stuff, like I could care less about all the mumbo jumbo inside of it, right? Because again, if you don't care about addressing the real issues, then why should I take you seriously? Right? So the other scenario here would be, oh, well, it's privately funded. Number one, I would like to see how exactly that is privately funded, right? Because again, like a lot of people say, oh, well, Google or YouTube, a private company, they can do what they want, but wouldn't you know, they've taken taxpayer money before. So again, I'd really like to see that. Like, here's the thing, like, if some organization wanted to set up um, a fund or whatever to where individuals could donate money without coercion voluntarily, and that money would end up being redistributed to poor black people, I wouldn't have a problem with that, right? I would not have a problem with that at all. But something tells me that isn't the case, right? It just really tells me that isn't the case. Um, so again, like if that is the case, then by all means. But I mean, if you're looking at, I mean, the city of Oakland's got to have, again, I've been there, but million people, 2 million people, I don't know. It's a pretty big city. I guess it depended if it would include all the suburbs. Um, but pretty big city. So you're looking at, I mean, this has got to be a lot of money. And this is coming from a state that's already in a lot of debt, probably a city that's in quite a bit of debt. So again, this money isn't just laying around. So where is it coming from? Like there's got to be tens of thousands of people that fall into this category. That's a lot of money. And this is the other thing too, like $500 a month would definitely help, but it's not going to fix the problem. And this is just another reason why I don't support reparations and I don't support UBI and all this kind of stuff, is that it won't fix the problem. At the end of the day, this is what always happens with this stuff is these people get their way and then they just push further and further and further. Right? It's like 10, 20 years ago, it was, oh, um, the there was no such thing as LGBT. I mean, kind of, but not nearly to the extent it is today. It was simply just we want gay and lesbian people to get married. Now it's drag queen story hour, and 5-year-olds are competent enough to decide if they should get their genders switched out or whatever, right? Again, whether you agree with that or I'm not even saying I disagree with it necessarily. I'm just simply saying that when you give these people an inch, they tend to take a mile, right? And I think the other bad aspect of it too is we are normalizing um, racism in society. Because again, like, why should a black person making $58,000 a year get this money, but a white person making, $25,000 a year not get it? How does that make any sense? And this is just another reason that that these leftists that care about, oh, we want to end poverty and the wealth gap and all this, no, they don't care about that. They care about power and pushing their political narrative. Because if they actually cared about ending poverty, they would care about ending poverty for everyone equally. But they don't, right? And part of the reason why they do this too is that they know this is going to be music to the ears of the far left, right? Because the problem with that is that it's never enough for those people, right? Like I brought up too, is that it's never going to be enough for these people, right? This $500 a month, it's not going to fix the problem. And are the people that supported it going to say, oh yeah, we tried this stuff, it didn't work, let's try something different? No, it's going to be, oh, it wasn't enough. This is why communism killed so many people over the way more than any other ideology, right? Because they try again. First, you get more taxes and more regulations, and then you get a little bit more, and then you get socialism, and then you get more socialism, and then you get communism. And every step along the way, when it wasn't working, the answer was, oh, we're not going far enough, guys. Not It doesn't work. Let's try something different. It's always continue to escalate more and more and more. That is what we're doing as a society. We're refusing to acknowledge the truth behind these things. Again, like, and this is something that even people on the I can't stand about people on the right, because people on the right tend to understand this stuff. They tend to understand that the biggest reason blacks are suffering is not racism, but they refuse to still acknowledge the reality behind the situation. Like, they kind of dance around the truth. The reason why blacks are suffering, number one, is the IQ thing, right? We know um, the higher your IQ, the more likely you are to earn more money, right? And again, people say, again, individuals are outliers, right? Individuals are always outliers. But when you're talking about millions of people, if you take a group of people, one with 80 IQ, another with 100, the people with 100 are going to be way better off. And it doesn't matter about skin color either. And so this comes back to the problem is, well, the average IQ of black Americans, I think, is like in the mid to high 80s. White Americans, it's like 100 roughly. Asians, slightly higher than that. Um, Jews, a little higher than that. Hispanics are in between blacks and whites. So again, this is the reason why this stuff exists. And it's not just that too. There's a lot of other stuff that goes into it, but that is the biggest one. Next biggest one is the welfare state, right? And the bigotry of low expectations, I think, are kind of tied in together there. Those are the two biggest things by far, and those are two things that we could fix by snapping our fingers. And this is the thing that it really just boggles my mind about people, is that they think, oh, it's a complicated, like, again, yeah, if you want to find a perfect solution, yeah, it's never going to happen. But taking a step in the right direction is as easy as snapping your fingers. We could do it overnight if we wanted. But because talking about IQ makes people very uncomfortable, because talking about the horrible failure that the welfare state has caused makes people uncomfortable, and they always straw man you and saying, oh, you hate the poor people, you want poor people to die, right? Like, that, just hyperbolic straw man that it is. And again, that's why. So again, this is the thing too. Like, I have no sympathy for these people that are suffering, because again, if people refuse to listen to reason, especially when it's so obvious, right? Especially when it's so obvious, I don't really care about your suffering when you refuse to listen to reason. Like, again, I've been over a comparable situation that I'm not even going to get into the whole virus situation, but that's a comparable thing. Like, again, like, this is the thing too. Like, The people that are actually being honest and actually acknowledging this stuff, yes, I have sympathy. The people that genuinely fall on hard times deserve sympathy. The people that are lazy, don't want to do anything with their lives, and blame their lack of purpose and job, or even a good job, on more racism, when the reality is that it's because they're lazy, or maybe they're just not very intelligent, right? That's another thing people need to talk about as well. And it's the same thing that goes for the whole women. There's not enough CEOs. Like, again, like if you look at the very high end of the IQ spectrum, tends to be where the CEOs fall. There's very little women. But if you look at the male versus female IQ, they're actually pretty much the same. But there's more men at the outliers, right? There's more men that are at the very low IQ, in the very low parts, and there's more men that are at the very high parts. And this is the reason why CEOs are overwhelmingly men. Same thing goes for overwhelmingly white, right? That there's very few blacks with 150 plus IQs, right? Then, not to mention, this is why Asians earn more money and Jews earn more money. They have higher IQs, right? It's very simple, right? Very simple. And again, the other reason why the other big reason why, so I forgot to bring it up. The biggest reason why people don't want to talk about the IQ stuff is that the left specifically, their entire political worldview is centered around, society was oppressive towards minorities and women. It still is oppressive towards society and women, and we will solve that problem for you. Regardless of whether you think they will solve it or not, that is what they believe. So if a competing theory can come along and completely contradict their entire worldview, of course they're not going to accept it. Right? Of course they're not going to accept it. So that is the reason why, the biggest reason why people don't want to talk about the IQ stuff. And the other reason too is that, the reason the right doesn't like talking about it is that they get called racist, right? If you talk about that stuff, you get called, even though it is, again, the left likes to talk about, oh, the science is settled on this, the science is settled on that. The science is settled on the IQ stuff, right? Again, if you take groups, the one with the higher IQ is going to earn more money. The one with the lower group is going to earn less money. The one with the lower group is going to be in jail more. And this is one of the big reasons why blacks are in jail more. It's not because of racism, it's because of lower IQ. And the reason that the way you can prove this is if you simply take whites with the same average IQ of blacks, the life outcomes are almost exactly the same. Same goes for blacks. Take blacks with an average IQ of 100, similar life outcomes. And the other last big thing I wanted to debunk here is the whole, poverty causes crime. It's not true, right? It's not true. There is a correlation, but it's not the causation. The reality is that crime causes poverty. How do we know this? Well, I mean, there's many, 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 many ways, but, um, the first one is that if you look at the places that have the highest levels of crime, in the states at least, they're overwhelmingly black. They're very disproportionately black, right? And if poverty caused crime, then you would simply look at the poorest white areas of the country, and they would have very high crime rates. But wouldn't you know, if you do that, you quickly find out that the very poor white areas don't have very high crime rates, at least compared to the black areas, right? So, poverty does not cause crime. There is a correlation, but it is not the causation, right? It is not the causation. So that's the last thing I wanted to bring up. So anyway, if you like the video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe. If you haven't already, make sure you check out those links below. Follow me on those other platforms. If you want to donate, you could do that as well. I would very much appreciate whatever support I can get. But at the very least, just hit that like and subscribe and stay tuned for more.